The air conditioner in my room at the Red Plains Motel hummed a low, mournful tune, a sound that seemed to be the official anthem of rural Oklahoma. It was a weary, rattling hum that did little to combat the oppressive, sticky heat of a late August night. Outside, beyond the thin, greasy glass of the window, the world was an impenetrable canvas of black. No streetlights, no passing cars, just the vast, empty plains stretching out into an abyss of darkness, punctuated only by the frantic, chirping orchestra of a million unseen insects. My name is Mai, and I was on day 3 of a cross-country road trip. A pilgrimage of self-discovery that was starting to feel more like a self-imposed exile. The plan had been simple. Drive from the suffocating familiarity of my life in California to, well, I hadn't figured that part out yet. The destination was less important than the journey, a cliché I had clung to like a life raft. But right now, sitting on the edge of a lumpy bed with a floral bedspread that smelled faintly of dust and bleach, the journey felt less like a romantic escape and more like a series of increasingly desolate motel rooms. The Red Plains Motel was a classic of the genre. A long, single-story building with a faded sign that flickered more than it shone. My room, number 7, was at the far end, next to what I assumed was a supply closet or another guest room. Number 8, the walls were thin, a fact I discovered when I heard the occupant of room 6 embark on a coughing fit that sounded like he was trying to excavate a lung. I had checked in just as the sun was bleeding out across the horizon, painting the endless sky in violent shades of orange and purple. The proprietor was a stooped, skeletal man with eyes that seemed to have seen too many decades of lonely travelers pass through his doors. He slid the key across the counter without much of a word, his gaze distant, as if he were already looking through me and at the empty highway beyond. I asked if the Wi-Fi was any good. He just grunted, a sound that could have meant anything, but which I correctly interpreted as, "Don't count on it." Now, in the dead of night, the silence of the place was profound. It wasn't a peaceful silence, it was a heavy, expectant one, the kind of quiet that makes you acutely aware of your own heartbeat. The soft rush of blood in your ears. I tried to read, but the words on the page blurred together, my mind too restless to focus. I was a tiny, insignificant speck in the middle of an enormous, uncaring void. The thought was both terrifying and, in a strange way, liberating. That's when I heard it for the first time. It was faint, almost imperceptible, slipping through the grimy window of the small, adjoining bathroom, a sound that cut through the drone of the air conditioner and the chorus of the crickets. It was the sound of a child crying. I froze, my book sliding from my lap onto the worn, rust-colored carpet. I held my breath, straining to hear it again. It was a weak, whimpering sound, the kind a very young child makes when they're not trying to get attention, but are simply lost in their own misery. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated sorrow. My first thought was one of annoyance. A crying baby in the next room meant a sleepless night. But the sound wasn't coming from room 6, where the coughing man resided. It was coming from the other side, from room 8, through my bathroom window, which was directly adjacent to its counterpart. I stood up and walked to the bathroom, the linoleum cold under my bare feet. The small, frosted window was cranked open just a crack, letting in the humid, insect-laden air. The crying was clearer here, a soft, desolate weeping that seemed to rise and fall with the gentle night breeze. It tugged at something primal within me, an instinct to comfort, to soothe. I listened for a few minutes, waiting for the sound of a parent's voice, a shushing, a lullaby, but there was nothing, just the solitary, heartbreaking cry. A deep sense of unease began to creep into the edges of my consciousness. It was past midnight. Why wasn't anyone attending to this child? Driven by a mixture of concern and a growing sense of dread, I slipped on my shoes, grabbed my key, and stepped out of my room into the thick, warm night. The air was heavy, clinging to my skin like a damp shroud. The only light came from the buzzing, fly-encircled fixtures above each door, casting long, distorted shadows across the cracked pavement of the parking lot. My car was the only one there. I walked the few steps to the door of room 8. It was dark. No light seeped from under the door or through the edges of the drawn curtains. I stood there for a moment, feeling foolish. What was I going to do? Knock on the door of a stranger in the middle of the night and demand they take care of their child? But the crying had stopped. The moment I had stepped outside, it had ceased. I pressed my ear against the cold, painted wood of the door. Silence. Not even the hum of an air conditioner. It was as if the room was empty. Confused, I walked back to my own room, the unease now churning in my gut. As soon as I closed the door behind me, I heard it again, starting up as if on cue. The faint, miserable weeping from the bathroom. My heart began to hammer against my ribs. This wasn't right. Something was profoundly wrong. I was suddenly hyper-aware of my isolation. The skeletal man at the front desk was probably asleep. The coughing man in room 6 was the only other soul I knew for certain was here. And beyond that, miles and miles of dark, empty plains. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the sound was traveling in a weird way. Maybe it was coming from further down, and the layout of the buildings was creating an acoustic illusion. Maybe it wasn't a child at all. Maybe it was a cat, a wounded animal. But I knew what I heard. It was the sound of human despair, small and helpless. I spent the next hour in a state of heightened alert, perched on the edge of the bed, my ears straining. The crying would continue for a few minutes, then fade into silence for a while, only to return, each time sounding a little more desperate, a little more hopeless. It was a tortuous rhythm, a symphony of sorrow that was slowly fraying my nerves. Sleep was an impossibility. The room, which had felt merely desolate before, now felt threatening. The shadows in the corners seemed to deepen, to coalesce. The rattling hum of the air conditioner sounded like a low growl. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was in that room. My mind raced. I couldn't call the police. Hello, officer? I'd like to report a sad sound. They'd think I was crazy. I had to talk to the owner. I threw on a jacket over my pajamas and marched out into the night again. This time, I didn't hesitate. I walked briskly toward the front office, a small building attached to the main motel structure. Its windows dark. A single, bare bulb illuminated a sign that read, "Office," and, below it, "Night Bell." I pressed the button. I heard a faint, distant buzzing from within. I waited. A minute passed. Then two. I was about to press it again when a light flickered on inside. The skeletal proprietor appeared from a back room, his face etched with annoyance. He unlocked the door and opened it a crack, his body blocking the entrance. "What?" he rasped, his voice like gravel scraping against stone. "I'm sorry to bother you," I began, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm in room 7. I hear a child crying. It's coming from the room next to me. Room 8. The man stared at me, his expression unchanging. He didn't seem surprised, or concerned, or even interested. He just stared, his pale eyes like chips of ice. "There's no one in room 8, he said flatly. "But I can hear it," I insisted, my voice rising with a note of hysteria. "It's a baby, or a small child. It's been crying for over an hour." "Room 8 is empty," he repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Hasn't been rented in weeks. The lock's busted from the inside. Can't even open it myself. Probably a feral cat got in there somehow. Go back to bed." He made to close the door, but I put my hand out, stopping it. "It's not a cat," I said, a desperate edge to my voice. "I know what a crying baby sounds like. Can you please just check? What if someone broke in? What if a child is in there? Alone?" A flicker of something that might have been anger crossed his face. He let out a long, weary sigh, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of all the strange nights he had endured in this place. "Fine," he grumbled. He disappeared for a moment and returned with a large, jangling ring of keys. "Come on." "But I'm telling you, there's nothing there." He led the way, his footsteps shuffling on the pavement. We stood before the dark door of room 8. He selected a key and slid it into the lock. It turned with a dull clunk, but the door didn't budge. He jiggled it, then tried to turn the handle. It was solid. "See?" he said, a note of grim satisfaction in his voice. "Locked from the inside, chains on. I told you." "But how?" I stammered. "If no one's in there." "Like I said," he cut me off, his patience clearly gone. "Busted. Now, I'm going back to bed. I suggest you do the same." He turned and shuffled away without another word, leaving me alone in the oppressive darkness, staring at the impassive face of door number 8. I was trembling. It wasn't just fear now, it was a deep, bone-chilling dread. The crying had started again. I could hear it, even from outside, a faint, muffled whimper that seemed to be coming from the very walls of the motel itself. I retreated to my room, locking the door and sliding the chain across. I even wedged the flimsy desk chair under the knob, a futile gesture that offered a sliver of psychological comfort. I turned off the light and lay in bed, my body rigid, my eyes wide open, staring into the impenetrable blackness of the room. The crying from the bathroom continued, a constant, miserable presence, but now, it was joined by another sound. A soft, rhythmic scraping. It was coming from the wall I shared with room 8. A slow, deliberate scrape. 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 As if a small, sharp object was being dragged across the dry wall. My blood ran cold. I imagined a child in that dark, empty room. A child who was not only crying but was now trying to claw its way through the wall. To get to me, I pulled the covers up to my chin, my breath catching in my throat. I tried to tell myself it was the pipes. It was the building settling. It was my overwrought imagination, fueled by exhaustion and the desolation of my surroundings. But the sounds were too real, too specific. The pathetic, lonely weeping and the insistent, desperate scraping. They were the only two sounds in the world besides the frantic pounding of my own heart. Hours passed. I don't know if I slept, or if I simply slipped into a state of paralyzed, waking nightmare. At some point, the scraping stopped, the crying faded away. A fragile, tentative silence descended upon the room once more. But it was not a comforting silence. It was the silence of something waiting, of something listening. I must have eventually drifted into a shallow, fitful sleep, because I was jolted awake by a new sound. A sound that was infinitely more terrifying than the crying or the scraping. It was a soft, wet, gurgling noise, and it was coming from right beside my bed. I opened my eyes. The first, pale hints of dawn were filtering through the grimy window, casting the room in a sickly, gray light. The air conditioner had finally sputtered into silence, and the absence of its hum was deafening. The gurgling sound came again. It was low, guttural, like someone trying to speak through a throat full of water. Slowly, my heart pounding a frantic, suffocating rhythm, I turned my head. On the floor, next to my bed, was a small, dark puddle, and from the center of this puddle, a single, tiny bubble rose to the surface and popped, releasing another soft, gurgling sigh. I stared at it, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. The puddle was spreading, seeping into the fibers of the old carpet, its edges dark and oily in the dim light. It looked like dirty water, like sewage. And then I saw the source. Directly above the puddle, on the ceiling, a dark, circular stain was forming. It was small at first, no bigger than a coin. But even as I watched, it grew, the dry wall around it darkening and softening. A single, thick, black drop of liquid gathered at its center, trembled for a moment, and then fell with a soft plip into the puddle below. The gurgling sound emanated from the stain. It was the sound of liquid being forced through a small, saturated opening. I scrambled back, crab walking across the bed until my back hit the cold wall. My eyes locked on the growing stain on the ceiling. It was directly above the spot where the scraping sound had come from. From the other side of the wall. From room 8. But that didn't make any sense. Room 8 was next to me, not above me. This was a single-story motel. There was nothing above my room but the roof. The stain continued to grow, its diameter now the size of a dinner plate. The dry wall around it began to sag, to bulge downwards, distended by the weight of the liquid it was absorbing. The gurgling became more insistent, and it was now joined by a low, humming vibration that I could feel through the wall against my back. And then I smelled it, a foul, cloying odor that filled the room in an instant. It was the smell of stagnant water, of rot and decay. The smell of a backed-up sewer drain. The smell of a forgotten, waterlogged grave. The bulge in the ceiling stretched further. The paint cracking. The dry wall groaning under the strain. It looked like a grotesque, pregnant belly, ready to burst. The gurgling sound was louder now, more frantic. It sounded like a drowning voice, desperately trying to draw a breath. I couldn't scream. The sound was trapped in my throat. A choked, silent sob. I was paralyzed by a terror so profound, so absolute, that my body refused to obey my commands. All I could do was watch. With a sickening, wet tear, the dry wall gave way. It wasn't a flood of water that came down. It was a thick, black, viscous sludge, pouring onto the carpet in a foul, steaming torrent, and with it came something else. A long, tangled mass of what looked like human hair, black and ropey, coated in the same filthy slime. It slithered out of the hole in the ceiling, followed by more of the sludge, more of the hair. It was like the motel itself was vomiting up some long-held, indigestible poison. And then, through the gurgling, I heard the voice again. Not crying this time, not whimpering. It was a single, clear, articulate word, spoken in the high, piping voice of a small child. A voice that was somehow both innocent and ancient, bubbling up from the depths of the black ooze. Mommy? The floor of my room was now covered in the black, foul-smelling liquid. It lapped at the legs of the bed, the stench so overpowering it made my eyes water and my stomach heave. The mass of hair on the floor twitched, moved, as if it were alive. That single word broke the spell of my paralysis. I flew off the bed, my feet splashing into the cold, viscous muck. I didn't care. I scrambled for the door, my hands fumbling with the chair, the lock, the chain. I burst out into the cool, clean air of the dawn, gasping, sobbing, my lungs burning. I didn't look back. I sprinted to my car, my bare, filth-covered feet slapping against the pavement. I wrenched the door open, threw myself inside, and fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so violently I could barely fit the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life. I slammed the car into reverse, not even bothering to look, and peeled out of the parking lot, spraying gravel and dirt behind me. I floored the accelerator, my eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. The door to my room, room 7, was wide open. A thick, black river of sludge was pouring out of it, spilling onto the pavement like a torrent of crude oil. It was moving, flowing away from my room, not towards the parking lot, but towards the side of the building, towards a large, grated storm drain set into the parched, cracked earth at the edge of the property. The black ooze, carrying the matted clumps of hair, was pouring itself into the drain, disappearing into the darkness below. It was as if the earth itself was reclaiming its refuse. As I sped down the empty highway, the rising sun a pristine, indifferent white in my mirror, I could still hear the child's voice in my head, not the crying, not the gurgling, but that one, final, horrifying word, a question that was not a question, a plea that was also a condemnation. I drove for hours, not stopping, not even to wipe the filth from my feet. I drove until the sun was high in the sky, until the desolation of Oklahoma had given way to the rolling hills of Texas. But I couldn't escape the smell. It clung to me, a phantom stench of rot and sewage that I think will follow me for the rest of my life. I never told anyone the full story. Who would believe me? They would say I was overtired, that I had a nightmare, a hallucination brought on by stress and loneliness. They would try to explain it away with logic and reason. Leaky pipes, a backed-up septic tank. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. Sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and I'm lying in bed, I can still hear it. The faint, desolate sound of a child crying. And sometimes, I find myself staring at the drains in my own home, the one in the shower, the sink, the grate in the street outside my window, with a deep, primal fear. I think about that motel, a festering wound on the face of the plains. I think about the proprietor with the dead eyes, a man who knew more than he was willing to say. And I think about room 8, locked from the inside, a room that was empty but was also, somehow, full. What was in that room? And what was in the space above my room? A space that shouldn't have existed? Where did that black, putrid sludge come from? I don't have any answers. And I don't think I want them. All I know is that some places are old, and some places are hungry. And sometimes, when you're on a lonely road in the middle of nowhere, you might stumble upon a place that has been waiting. A place with a thirst that can't be quenched. A place with a drain that leads not to a sewer, but to somewhere else entirely. Somewhere deep, Somewhere dark. Somewhere endless.